Well, I've got some pretty bad news. Looks like old journalist Andy Ngo, who some of you may follow on Twitter, has been beaten up and sent to the hospital by a Antifa mob in Portland. Now, I've followed Andy Ngo for quite some time, I guess at least a couple of years, it would seem. And he's always done a good job, in my opinion. He goes to the Antifa rallies in Portland and just videotapes them and reports on what happens there, because, that's not the kind of thing that gets national news coverage. So his Twitter feed I find pretty interesting. He takes pictures of the signs they have and stuff and how people are dressed. And of course, Antifa hates him for it because they hate people who take pictures for some reason. I guess because they're ashamed of what they're doing. You never see folks at, say, I don't know what an analogous rally would be, but typically when you see a group of right-wingers, you're not going to see them trying to punch people who have cameras and, send them away. I just haven't seen that. I've never seen, right-wingers, at least in America, certainly in other countries they do, beat up folks who are taping them. They're normally glad to have publicity because, the thing that the right-wingers are always upset about is that, the media won't cover us. They won't cover us. The media has a total blackout. So normally, right-wingers are very happy to get attention from anyone who wants to record them and put them on the internet. Of course, the right wing has thrived on places like YouTube, where, of course, I think Andy also posts videos, just really recording Antifa. But it looks like they finally snapped this past weekend. They've hated him for a long time. I've never really quite understood the hatred, but then again, I don't really understand much of anything that these Antifa folks do. And so a mob of them decided to gang up and start beating him up in the crowd. And of course, he was trapped because he was completely surrounded by people. And I saw a video of it. It didn't look very nice. I certainly would not wanted to have been him. Now, interestingly enough, they kind of looked... They looked like they were still being cautious, even though he was completely defenseless and holding a camera and stuff and couldn't hit back. But they were, taking turns one at a time, just taking these, light little jabs at him. But they got in some good hits, certainly, because he was bloodied up pretty bad. And, of course, they threw a concrete milkshake on him. Now, some of you may be familiar with, a fast food chain called Culver's, which sells concrete mixers that are milkshakes. That's not what this was. This was an actual cup of quick dry concrete that they threw on the guy, which is a little worse than what they threw on Nigel Farage. Obviously, if somebody throws concrete on, say in your face, I don't think it hit him in the face. I think it hit him in the back. That wouldn't end too well, especially if it dries on you. It's, and a lot of people, if they get, since this milkshaking thing has been going on, I'm sure when he first got that thrown on him, he thought, somebody just threw a milkshake on me. So you wouldn't exactly run to a hose to try and wash the crap off. But then when it dries and you realize your face is now encased in concrete, that could be a problem. I mean, imagine if they threw this on somebody and they ingested a mouthful of it and then they swallowed concrete. I mean, it's a pretty sinister weapon. Frankly, I've always found the Antifa folks much scarier than, say, Redneck Revolt, which is another far-left communist group. Because at least Redneck Revolt, they're gun owners and they have a bit of discipline and they're not exactly going to fly off the handle and start whacking people with blunt instruments. And also, I find most blunt instruments to be scarier than guns because you can get into a situation a lot easier where people are whacking you with clubs or, bats with nails coming out of it like, what's his name from The Walking Dead. Shooting is considered to be a much more severe allegation, and that pretty much would disperse a crowd pretty quick. But if you're in a crowd and somebody's whacking you with a baseball bat, or with a club or something like that, or throwing, quick dry concrete on you, that can go by, and the rest of the crowd could be unfazed. I think that's much more of a scary tactic, from a terror standpoint. Now, I'm actually even surprised by this. The media somehow are finding a way to defend Antifa and say essentially that Andy had it coming, which is, needless to say, disgusting. But I thought that was even below most of them, the media folks. There were, a couple who came to his defense, like Jake Tapper, tweeted out the very obvious statement saying, hey, you shouldn't be beating up journalists and sending them to the hospital and bloodying up their heads and things. And actually, speaking of which, apparently Andy has a brain hemorrhage, which is pretty bad. It's much worse than initially thought. I was looking at his Twitter feed and I saw him post a couple pictures and I'm like, oh, that sucks. He got cracked over the head and got bloodied up a bit. But actually, he seems to be very severely injured by this. But anyway, Jake Tapper essentially said, hey, this is a bad thing. People shouldn't be beating up journos. And all the blue checks ratioed Jake Tapper and said, "Oh, Jake, how could you come to the defense of this white supremacist neo-Nazi, who, by the way, is a gay Asian man?" I don't know how the white supremacist neo-Nazi works into that sort of an identity, but yeah, Tapper, for coming to his defense and saying, "Hey, we shouldn't beat people up and throw concrete on them," he was completely shredded by his fellow blue-check journos. One very popular tweet I saw that last I checked had about 5,300 likes was from a guy who was there and said, "It's strange how me and the other 100 journalists who were there doing our job covering the anti-fascist protest were not assaulted, but this Andy guy was. Weird." And his point, again, was that Andy had it coming and he must have done something to provoke the crowd. Now, interestingly enough, the guy who tweeted this out you can see the banner, his banner pic on Twitter is of a book essentially saying, what modern fascism is and how to stop it. So essentially he is Antifa. He's a supporter of theirs. He may, not actively dress in black bloc and riot, but he goes there to cover their rallies in a supportive way, and he literally wrote a book about their ideology. From a personal perspective, it wasn't descriptive, it was, proscriptive. And so do you think, buddy, that maybe the reason why you weren't beat up is because you're one of them? Because they were beating up an outsider who disagreed with them? And I think that if I asked him that directly, he would say yes. And that's the problem, is that Andy Ngo is asking for it by disagreeing with Antifa. Because, of course, Antifa is short for anti-fascist. So if you don't like Antifa, well, then you love Nazis. That's what that means. Of course, calling yourself an anti-fascist is a very clever way of disguising the fact that you're just a overt communist, because, of course, the original Antifa group from Weimar Germany that these people are emulating, that they aspire to become, was a group of communists who wanted to beat up the Hitlerian Nazis. And, of course, as Stefan Molyneux put very succinctly, communists are violent people. That's just how they are. Also, so are Nazis. But we don't have any Nazis in America. They really don't exist. We used to have some. They're a very small number now. The neo-Nazi thing was never very popular, despite what people want to tell you. The fact that, or the idea that you need to have these big riots to stand up against neo-Nazis in Portland, Oregon, is a bunch of hysteria. It's just an excuse to promote their communist ideology. It's a phantom menace, essentially. No pun intended there. I did not mean to reference that terrible Star Wars movie. Now, a lot of people certainly are talking about this because Andy is a rather prominent guy on Twitter, and a lot of us follow him, and so people are, quite alarmed by this. And some folks I think, are making the case that this is an escalation by Antifa and that, somehow the culture war will get worse because of this. I really don't think that's the case. I don't think enough people follow Andy Ngo to be outraged by this. Andy is not he's not some mainstream conservatism Inc. sort of guy. It's not like Rush Limbaugh went to Portland and got beat to a pulp. Andy is someone who a lot of us that follow this stuff know, but he's not somebody that average Americans know. And of course, because of that, this isn't really an escalation, because Antifa beats up people all the time. There was Bike Lock, what was his name, Bike Lock Billy or something they called him, the guy who cracked over somebody in the head with a bike lock on somebody else who was using a sack of butter and a sock. Again, as Steph said, communists are violent people. Antifa does this all the time. They beat people up. It's just, they're a bunch of thugs, and they're also cowards. That's why they cover their face and they work the streets in packs. So I don't think that this is a particularly pivotal moment in the history of the modern American culture war or anything. But it's certainly something to keep an eye on. That's why I follow Andy. Antifa feels like a very distant problem to me. It's not something that is that's in my town. I don't think it's in most of America. I think that this is largely a Portland phenomenon, and it's certainly an exclusively coastal phenomenon. You're not going to find Antifa springing up in Birmingham, Alabama in large numbers, I don't think, and beating people up. And frankly, the more attention that Antifa gets, the less popular they'll become, to the extent that they had any popularity to begin with, because most Americans are not to the point yet that they want to beat up people who disagree with communism. We're not really to that point yet. Not even in the Soviet Union do I think you could have found, in the 1950s, could you think you could have found people who were willing to do that, who were going to be as violent as Antifa folks are, on a large scale. They're not a threat. Just like neo-Nazis. I don't think that that your hardline communists are a threat. Are they a bigger threat than the Nazis? Yes, because at least they have enough numbers to muster, these kinds of rallies regularly, and they do certainly act emboldened. The neo-Nazis are anything but emboldened. They certainly, they walk around like a pack of towering mutts. There's really nothing for them to do. A lot of them have become, what you call black-pilled. They just think, oh, the white race is going to go extinct, and there's nothing I can do about it. The Antifa folks, on the other hand, are not black-pilled on communism. They think communism will happen today, and it'll work this time. We promise. So that's about all I have to say on that. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.